This is a Best in Climate episode of Earth Feels, where each week your hosts Rose and Christine read to you from some of the best climate-related blogs and articles on the web.
Hello, it's Rose here. You may have seen the sobering statement on Friday of the UN warning that the planet is on track to warm by 2.7 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels by 2100, by the end of the century, despite efforts made under the Paris Agreement on climate, an agreement that seeks to keep temperatures no more than 2 degrees, ideally 1.5 degrees. And it occurs to me that many may not understand the significance of holding average global temperatures down. As the universe would have it, I'm reading Barbara Kingsolver's 2012 novel, Flight Behavior, which although almost 10 years in the rearview mirror, is a fictionalized account of the plight of the monarch butterfly. In it, a scientist dedicated to studying monarchs comes to an Appalachian town where millions of monarchs are discovered overwintering in a new location after their habitat in Mexico is destroyed by flooding and landslides, a side effect of human beings logging, a side effect of climate change. The passage that I've chosen to read today for Best in Climate is a lunch scene where that fictionalized scientist, whose name is Ovid, is explaining carbon dioxide parts per million and the frightening aspect of global temperature rise to Della Robbia, who is the heroine of the story. And he explains it in a language so succinctly that any layperson can understand it. So today's Best in Climate is an excerpt from Barbara Kingsolver's Flight Behavior, and it starts on page 277. Why does Pete call them the 350 Boys? Della Robbia asks. It's their organization, 350.org. But what does that mean? Parts per million, he said in a muffled way, between bites. Honestly, I'm a little worried about those two. They exist on political commitment and GORP. She thought, GORP? But asked, parts per million? 350 parts per million, he replied. The number of carbon molecules the atmosphere can hold and still maintain the ordinary thermal balance. It's an important figure. I suppose they want to draw attention. Roger came back to retrieve his coat from where he'd left it on the ground, offering a quick little wave. The coat was patched copiously with duct tape. If it gets cold enough, Della Robbia thought, maybe he'll tape up those bare legs as well. She wondered if she should offer him some trousers at second time around. It's a greenhouse gas, carbon, Owen added. It traps the heat of the sun. That number has been going up, right before our eyes, as they say. You're telling me someone actually counts the atoms? It's not very difficult with the right equipment. Her heart was still thumping like a drum, as it had all morning whenever she saw or thought of him. But his talk steadied her and his vulnerability. He had practically swallowed his sandwich whole. She set hers aside and dug in her purse for something presentable in the way of an emergency food supply. So the carbon goes up when we burn oil and stuff. She was working to hold her thoughts in place. He nodded. Up, up, up. She found what she was looking for, a single serving cup of diced peaches, and handed it to him. So what goes out of whack when it hits 350? The thermal stability of the planet. He studied the little plastic cup for a moment before grasping it and pulling off the foil seal. She watched him down it like a glass of water and tried to think of any other edibles she might be carrying on her person. What are we up to so far? He swallowed a few times before speaking. About 390. What? We went past? Why hasn't everything blown up? He studied the empty cup in his hand. Some would say it has. Hurricanes reaching 100 miles inland, wind speeds we've never seen, deserts on fire. In New Mexico, we are seeing the inferno. Texas is worse. Australia is unimaginably worse. A lot of the continent is in permanent drought. Farms abandoned forever. She pictured orchards like the Cooks dying on the other side of the world for the opposite reason. Rain being sent to the wrong places, in the wrong amounts. Why wouldn't they just irrigate the farms, she asked. Because of firestorms. Oh. Walls of flame, Della Robbia, traversing the land like freight trains, fed by dead trees and desiccated soil. In Victoria, hundreds of people burned to death in 1 month. So many their prime minister called it hell on earth. This has not happened before. There is not an evacuation plan. She remembered telling Dovey, her best friend, that hell had gone out of fashion. They sat in silence. Through the trees, she saw Carlos stand up from his crouch and do some kind of yoga pose, folding his arms together over his head to stretch his muscles. They never complained, those two boys. Is the number still going up? She asked. Everything that has brought us here continues without pause, Ovid said. She thought of Cub kicking at the frost. So will winter just end then? I suppose it might, but it wouldn't be our worry anymore. It will only take a few degrees of change, global average, to knock our kind out of the running. She stared, her first completely direct look at him since the accidental sighting. What do you mean, out of the running? Living systems are sensitive to very small changes, Della Robbia. Think of a child's temperature elevated by 2 degrees. Would you call that normal? 100. That's a low-grade fever, she said. Aches and chills. Della Robbia disliked the thermometer she kept in her makeup drawer, the treacherous slime glass pipe and its regime of wakeful nights, the croups, the earaches. Her children's cheeks hot to the touch, their racked sobs that drenched her will for living. And if the temperature keeps going up, he asked. More? At 103, I'd head for the emergency room. That's 4.5 degrees. More than that, don't make me think about. Interesting, he said. I just read a UN climate report of many hundred pages, and its prognosis for a febrile biosphere matches the one you just gave me in a sentence. Degree for degree. She felt very unsettled by the fever talk. Just the smell of rubbing alcohol weakened her knees. It keeps me awake nights, that report, he said, shadowing her thoughts. A 4-degree rise in the world's average temperature might be unavoidable at this point. So we are headed for the ER, as you put it. The accumulation plays out for a very long time, even if we stop burning carbon. But if you stop something, it stops, she said, sounding a little too fine. We used to think so. But there are unstoppable processes, like the loss of polar ice. White ice reflects the heat of the sun directly back to space. But when it melts, the dark land and water underneath it hold on to that heat. The frozen ground melts, and that releases more carbon into the air. These feedback loops keep surprising us. How could this be true, she thought, if no one was talking about it? People with influence, important people, made such a big deal over infinitely smaller losses. So it's not a question of having Floridian winters in Tennessee, he said. That is not even under discussion. Is there some part of this I can actually see? You don't believe in things you can't see? He asked. She thought of Blanche Bice and Bible class, the flood of Noah, Jesus. She did try. It's never been my long suit, she confessed. How about your children's adulthood? That nearly floored her. or creaked her, since that's what was below this log if she swooned off of it. How dare he belt her with that one? A trend is intangible but real, he said calmly. A photo cannot prove a child is growing, but several of them can show change over time. Align them, and you can reliably predict what is coming. You never see it all at once. An attention span is required. I can break it down for you, he said. Water, you can see that. Warm air holds more water. Think of condensation on a windshield. Multiply that times all the square meters above you, and it's a hell of a lot of water. It evaporates too quickly from the hot places and floods the wet ones. Every kind of weather is intensified by warming. So flood and fire, basically, like the prophecy. I don't know about that. What does the Bible say about the ice albedo effect? He was mocking her, probably. I don't think the prophecy applies in real-world terms, she said. People assume it's out there, I guess, the lake of fire and everything, but they figure it's still a long way off, way past the end of T-ball season, after the kids' graduation, after the wedding. She stopped before her children, Cordelia and Preston, came into this picture. The afternoon was already waning, its softer light filling the sky with a liquid seeping between the trees. Ovid's attention to her felt like a promise, and she wanted to trust it, only not the particular words. To leap and forget the crash landing. She finished her sandwich while he talked. He told her that forests absorb carbon from the sky, but not when they are dying of drought or burning. The oceans also buffer the atmosphere, but not when their carbon levels make them too acidic for life. The oceans, he said, were losing their fish. And coral reefs. Have you ever seen a coral reef? She wished she could just touch his hand and stop this. She noticed the crow's feet around his eyes, his exhaustion. It must have been true about this keeping him awake. I've seen the beach, she said, but I guess that's not the same. One day I will tell you about the reefs. It's all I wanted to do as a boy, swim in the reef and make my little studies. My mother said I would turn into a fish. She couldn't see these things at all, stricken forests or killing tides. What she saw was the boy inside a man who was losing everything. She felt the way she did when her children howled over outcomes they couldn't change. Helpless. Everything goes. They say it's just cycles, she said after a while, that it goes through this every so often. He let out a little hiss between his teeth, which scared her. All right, in the Pleistocene, most of this continent was under ice, and the rest was Arctic desert. At other times, the ice caps melted, and this very place was under the ocean. So yes, cycles, with millions of years between events, my friend, not decades. She did not like my friend. She did not hazard a comment, but he prodded. Della Robbia, what do you see? We've never had a rain like we did last year. I'll grant you that. I'm asking literally, what do you see? She looked at the trees, the forest floor. 1,000,000 dead butterflies, she said. Sorry as hell they ever landed here. A live monarch dropped through the air and landed on a clump of grass near Ovid's boots. She watched it crawl slowly to the top of the drooping seed head, clinging upside down beneath the ark. It folded its wings together, closing up shop for the night, waiting for a better day tomorrow. Humans are in love with the idea of our persisting, he said. We fetishize it, really. Our retirement funds, our genealogies, our so-called ideas for the ages. I really hate this, what you're saying, just so you know. Sorry, I am a doctor of natural systems, and this looks terminal to me. In the branches over their heads, small bursts of butterflies exploded into the sun like soundless fireworks. The beauty was irresistible. I just can't see it being all bad, she said. I'd say most people wouldn't. He nodded. Slowly. Do you know scientists had a devil of a time convincing people that birds flew south in winter? The Europeans used to believe they burrowed into muddy riverbanks to hibernate. They would see the swallows gathering along the river in autumn and then disappearing. Africa was an abstraction to these people. The notion of birds flying there for unknown reasons they found laughable. Well, she said, I guess seeing is believing. Refusing to look at the evidence, this is also popular, he said. It's not that we're all just lazy-minded. Maybe you think so. She struggled to articulate her defense. On first sight, she'd taken these butterflies for fire and magic. Monarchs were nowhere in her mind. Probably he wouldn't believe that. People can only see the things they already recognize, she said. They'll see it if they know it. They use inference systems, he said. Okay, that. And how do they see the end of the world, Ovid asked, in real world terms, as you put it. She considered this for a long time. They know it's impossible. He nodded, surprised. Golly, I think you're right. She took the plastic cup from his hands and wrapped it in the cellophane that had held her sandwich. She could feel where her fingertips had brushed his. I don't know how a person could even get through the day knowing what you know, she said. So there you have it. A no-nonsense explanation of what happens when our planet runs a fever. If you've yet to read Kingsolver's Flight Behavior, I recommend it highly. It's an eye-opening account of the real divide that exists today between ivory tower academics and working classmen, city folk and those residing in rural towns, the scientific and the religious communities. And it gives a much-needed understanding of people's individual belief systems. But perhaps most frightening to me was the fact that in 2012, when Flight Behavior was published, our carbon levels were at 390 parts per million. As of this morning, we are at 414, with no real means of slowing down. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you next time.
That's this week's episode of Best in Climate for Earth Feels.
Special thanks to singer-songwriter Kristen Hoffman for generously allowing us to use Song for the Ocean. Thanks for listening.
Don't forget, subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss an episode. Catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Children of the earth, I'm calling out. There's a mission for you and for me.